Sometimes life doesn't knock or announce itself. It simply stops in the middle of a building, between two floors, between one moment and the next. And in that unexpected pause, where everything goes still and nothing is required of you, someone sits across from you, a stranger. Not by accident, perhaps, but by a quiet arrangement of time and gravity, and maybe something softer. This is not a love story in the way you think. There are no grand confessions, no tangled sheets, no promises made beneath candlelight. Just two people. An elevator, a pause, and the kind of silence that listens more deeply than words ever could. So lie down, close your eyes, and let this moment find you. Because somewhere between hello and goodbye, something beautiful waited. And it didn't ask for anything but your presence. Asterisk. You didn't think twice about it. Just your index finger stretched out like it had 100 times before, pressing the silver button that lit up faintly under your touch. It wasn't symbolic. Not yet. It was just routine, the elevator button glowing like a small, silent yes. In a hallway that barely echoed with your footsteps. Another floor. Another errand. Another evening that would pass like steam on a mirror. That's what you thought anyway. You had no idea that this was the last quiet moment before everything shifted. That when the doors slid open, so would something in you. The lobby was mostly empty, washed in the golden fatigue of end of daylight. The smell of warm tile, coffee ghosts from the afternoon, and something faintly floral from the nearby concierge. Desk Galva coated your senses like background music. You'd had a long day, maybe a forgettable one, the kind you could summarize in a breath and never repeat. Your phone buzzed once in your pocket, but you didn't check it. Not because you didn't care, but because you already knew whatever. It could wait. You were carrying something small, maybe a tote bag or a coffee you hadn't finished, or a grocery bag with only one thing in it. Something that suggested you weren't staying out long. Something that hinted your evening had no intention of being eventful. The elevator dinged, that soft, familiar sound. Like a piano key struck gently, reminding you to move. You stepped inside. It smelled like cold air and old metal and faint citrus, like someone had been chewing gum and left just enough of themselves behind. You turned toward the control panel, pressed the button for your floor. The elevator jolted softly, just enough to remind you of gravity, and began its climb alone. That's how you thought the ride would go. Alone, like most elevator rides. Alone, like most of your evenings. Alone in the comfortable, quiet way that didn't feel sad anymore. You leaned slightly into the wall, your shoulder grazing the mirror, watching the numbers tick upward above the door. You weren't thinking about anything in particular. Maybe you were replaying a part of your day. Maybe you were wondering what leftovers were still in your fridge. You were there, but not fully. Moving, but not arriving. Then it stopped. Not on your floor, Dot, just somewhere in between, Dot, and with the same small ding. The doors opened again. You didn't turn fully at first. You only glanced, and that's when you saw him. He stepped in with the kind of energy people have when they think no one's watching. No grand gestures, no charm turned on. Just a guy in a dark jacket, earbuds tucked into his shirt collar, keys already in his hand like a talisman. His eyes flicked up briefly, caught yours, and in that instant something passed between you. Not lightning, not thunder, just recognition like a page being dog-eared in a book. You hadn't realized you were reading. He stood a respectful distance away, pressed a button that must have been below yours, and the elevator started moving again. Weren't thinking about love. This wasn't a movie. No swelling music, no soft focus lighting. Just two strangers inside a slow-moving box of metal and mirrors. You stood there, exactly 3 feet apart, surrounded by quiet hums and the occasional mechanical groan. But even in the silence, something stirred Dot because he didn't reach for his phone. He didn't shift away. He just stood like he was here. Not elsewhere. Not already escaping in his mind. Here like he was actually inside this moment. With you. You felt the air change, not dramatically, not enough to comment on. Just enough to notice, Dot, you shifted your weight from one foot to the other. Glanced up. His reflection met yours in the mirrored panel beside you for 1 second too long. Not flirty, not invasive, just curious. Dot, you offered a small smile. Not because you had to, because something about him felt open, like a door you didn't know you were allowed to knock on. He smiled back, quick, quiet, but it reached his eyes, and then he spoke. Long day. You blinked, Dot, not because of the question, but because his voice was lower than you expected, warm, unpolished, like the underside of velvet. Is it that obvious? You replied. He chuckled. Only because I was thinking the same. It wasn't FLIRTY. It wasn't romantic, but it was the beginning of something. A thread barely pulled, and you, without realizing it, had already begun to follow it. Asterisk, there's something funny about elevators. How they pretend to be nothing at all, just transit, just small, slow machines moving people up and down. But inside, time doesn't pass the same way. You're sealed in a little in-between, neither here nor there. Like the air is slightly thicker, like everything unsaid becomes louder. Like your own heartbeat remembers how to echo. You weren't supposed to notice him this much. After all, you've shared elevators with strangers before. People caught in their own thoughts, faces bathed in phone light, minds already halfway out the doors before they close. But this man, he wasn't like that. He wasn't hiding in a screen or pretending you weren't there. He was present, fully, impossibly present. And not just in that polite, nod and smile kind of way. No, it was different. He was watching you, not staring, not devouring, just noticing. The glance happened fast, maybe a second, maybe a little more. But you didn't mean to hold it. You only looked to be polite, to acknowledge his question, his presence. But something in your eyes lingered, something in his did too. And there it was, the shift. That pause between when something is nothing and when something becomes something. The elevator numbers ticked on. 1 floor, 2, 3. The walls hummed softly, and the metal cables above you whispered through the shaft. But none of it mattered, because now you were inside a bubble, not just of space, but of something warmer, something uncertain. His hand was tucked casually into his pocket. Your fingers toyed with the strap of your bag like they needed a chore to distract them. Your eyes, though, they betrayed you. You didn't want to keep looking, but you did dot. It wasn't his looks. Not exactly. Though yes, his jaw had that kind of unshaved softness that suggested he hadn't tried too hard today. His shirt was rumpled, but not careless. He looked like someone who didn't spend much time on mirrors, but still had a face you'd want to memorize. But that wasn't it. It was his stillness, his quiet attention. Like he wasn't trying to fill the space, but he wasn't afraid to sit in it either. He tilted his head slightly, a tiny, unreadable smile at the corner of his mouth. You look like someone who always has some place to be. You raised a brow. And what do I look like now? He shrugged, but his voice softened. Like you're wondering what this moment wants from you? You didn't answer. Not right away. Because how do you answer a sentence like that from someone whose name you don't even know? You let out a breath. It came out like a quiet laugh. Well, that's one hell of a guess. He smiled wider now, not cocky, not smug, just amused, comfortable, as if making you feel seen didn't scare him in the slightest dot, and maybe that was what threw you off most, because being seen, truly seen, has never come easy. Not in brief encounters. Not in rooms like this, where eye contact feels like trespassing. And yet, there he was, noticing you in ways you weren't prepared for, not in your best clothes, not with your lipstick freshly done, not while you were trying to be anyone but exactly who you were in this quiet corner of the day, and it felt nice dot dangerous dot, but nice dot the elevator slowed. You both felt it, that faint, invisible pull as the brakes caught, and the machine prepared to open its doors to someone else's floor, someone else's hallway, someone else's story. You looked forward. He did too. You waited for the break in the moment, but the doors didn't open. The hum stopped. The lights dimmed just for half a second. Like the room blinked out, then nothing. The elevator didn't move. The doors stayed shut in time. Shifted. He looked at you. You looked at him and neither of you reached for the alarm. The moment hit like a breath held too long, then let out all at once. The elevator jerked downward, just a twitch in the cables, like someone had tugged on the wrong thread. You instinctively reached for the wall. So did he. Your palms didn't touch, but they landed within inches of each other. Fingers splayed across brushed metal that suddenly felt more like boundary than support. You didn't say anything at first, neither of you did. Just eyes shifting, breath tightening, thoughts scrambling like beads off a broken string. Then dash stillness. Not the calm kind, the holding kind, that eerie, humming hush that follows after emotion disappears, and you start wondering whether the next sound will be a voice through a speaker or your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. Your eyes met, not in the nervous, what just happened way, but in the slow, wide-eyed way that people look when they realize they've just stepped off the map and don't quite mind it yet. He tilted his head toward the panel. Well, that's new. You laughed under your breath. Not because it was funny, but because humor is the first raft you reach for when the water surprises you. No emergency button. You asked, already knowing the answer. He squinted. Nope, just a call button. Probably goes to a desk that closed 20 minutes ago. You didn't panic, and neither did he. Maybe because you weren't alone. Maybe because panic takes space, and the air between you was already thick with something else. Something curious, quiet, and hard to name. You pulled your phone out. One bar, no signal. He tried his, shook his head. Dead zone, he muttered. Figures. Then came the second silence. Not the startled one, but the one that follows it. The silence where two people realize they might be here longer than they thought, and neither is sure what to do with that knowledge. You leaned your back fully against the elevator wall. It felt cooler now, like your skin had become more sensitive. The hum of the machinery was gone, and the stillness stretched across your shoulders like dusk. He slid down to sit on the floor, one knee up, the other stretched lazily. Might as well make ourselves comfortable, he said. He gestured, not with assumption, but with invitation. You joined him. The floor wasn't soft, but it wasn't cold either. Just neutral, like everything else in this strange metal room you now shared. You sat side by side, just enough distance to keep it appropriate, just close enough for the air to braid itself between your shoulders. For a while, neither of you said anything. The kind of silence that would feel awkward on a date. But this wasn't a date. It wasn't anything yet. It was two people with nowhere to go and too much time to pretend not to notice each other. He sighed gently. You ever feel like the universe pushes pause just to mess with you? You tilted your head back against the wall. Or maybe to see what you'll do when you have no control. He smiled. You sound like someone who thinks about things too much. You turned to him, mouth quirking. You sound like someone who avoids thinking at all. He laughed. It was a warm, low sound, 30 and real. Touché. There was a beat, then another, and just like that, the tension that had been sitting tight in your shoulders began to release. Not because you trusted him. Not yet. But because there was something easy in the way, he let the moment be what it was. He didn't try to fix it, didn't try to entertain it. He just settled into it, like weather, like wind that chooses not to blow too hard. Do you think we'll be here a while? You asked. He shrugged, glanced up at the unmoving numbers above the door. Long enough to tell a story, maybe? You looked at him. A story. A strange thing to offer, but he said it like a challenge, and you didn't feel like walking away from a challenge tonight, Dot, so you said, all right, tell me yours. And he did, but not the kind of story you expected. Asterisk, it's funny the way laughter sneaks in, not when you expect it, not when you plan it, but when the silence has stretched just far enough to start feeling heavy and someone decides to let a little light in. That's how it came in here, not from a punchline, not from a perfect delivery. Just from two strangers sitting on the floor of a motionless elevator, trying to keep the quiet from turning into something sharp. I once got stuck in an elevator during a job interview. He said, you turned toward him, surprised. No way. He nodded, hand lazily drawing shapes on the thigh of his jeans. I was wearing this awful suit, sweating through it. I was so nervous I forgot to breathe, and then Bam stuck between floors. What did you do? I started practicing my pitch to the elevator walls, he said with a grin. Gave the best damn sales pitch of my life to the fireman who pried the doors open. He gave me a bottle of water and said I should work in radio. You laughed. You couldn't help it. It was the kind of story that didn't need to be polished to be good. It was all in the way he told it, with that casual tone, that crook smile, like the world hadn't quite knocked the wonder out of him yet. That's not real. You. Sad. He placed his hand over his heart, eyes wide in mock sincerity. Swear on my elevator trauma. You shook your head, still smiling. All right, your turn to ask something. Elevator confessions? Go. He tilted his head, thoughtful. Okay, worst first date? You groaned, the kind of groan that meant you didn't even need to think. Easy. Blind date. He ordered for me without asking, told me when and shouldn't. Drink whiskey, then made me split the bill because equality. He winced. Oof, that's a lot of red flags in 1 hour. Hour, you said? I left after 15 minutes, faked a phone call, walked straight out. He nodded approvingly. Respect. It went on like that. Little stories, silly stories, ones you wouldn't normally share with someone whose last name you didn't know. But that's the thing about strange suspended moments. They make room for the kind of honesty you don't often get to practice. There's no script, no agenda, just breath and voice and the quiet understanding that no one's watching. You learned that he once fell asleep on a bus and woke up 3 towns past his stop. That he used to play the piano as a kid but hadn't touched one in years. That he hated olives. That he once got stage fright during a college poetry reading and recited the alphabet instead of his poem. And in return, You told him things you rarely told anyone, but you still missed your childhood cat. That you talked to yourself in grocery store aisles. That sometimes you cry when songs get too beautiful. You weren't trying to impress him. And he wasn't trying to impress you. You were just present, fully, completely, in a way you hadn't been with another human in longer than you cared to admit. And the laughter, it came in waves, soft chuckles, little bursts. The kind that make your shoulders drop, make your lungs remember how to expand. The kind that build trust without asking for it. At one point, he offered you a breath mint from a tin in his pocket. In case we die here, he joked, I don't want my ghost to have bad breath. You smirked. How thoughtful of you. And nothing if not considerate in my final hours. You took one, because why not? Because sharing breath with a stranger is a strange kind of intimacy, because even in the middle of nowhere, stuck in a box between floors, it's human to want to feel seen, and funnier still to want to be charming. While doing it, you were beginning to relax, your back pressed to the wall, your knees drawn up slightly. You were aware of how close he was now, not in a way that made you nervous, in a way that made you curious about how he smelled, about the heat of his arm, about whether he could hear your heart slowing down. He leaned his head back too, exhaled softly. You know, he said, if the elevator doesn't move for a while, we might have to start assigning roles. Roles? Yeah, like I'll be the navigator, you'll be in charge of morale, and if it comes to it, we'll vote someone. Off the floor, you grinned. There's only two of us. I know. That's what makes it dramatic. You rolled your eyes, giggling now. A real one. The kind that spills out of you without your permission. This wasn't a meet dash cute dot. This was something else. Something gentler. Something made of soft pauses and silly metaphors, and the feeling that even in a confined space, there was room to breathe. Looked over at him. He was watching you, but not in a way that made you feel on display. It was more like he was memorizing something, not your features, but the way you existed in this moment. And maybe that was the first time you realized you weren't just passing time, you were being felt. There's a particular kind of honesty that only visits you when time bends. Not the kind you rehearse or the kind you use to win someone over. No, it's the kind that emerges when the world forgets you exist for a little while, when no one is listening, no one is waiting, no one expects a version of you at all. That's what this elevator gave you, a capsule of now, of suspended consequence. And in that stillness, the conversation drifted deeper. You don't remember who started it. Maybe he asked what your favorite place in the world was. Or maybe you asked about the last time he felt truly free. The words came slowly at first, like toes in cold water, and then with more ease, more warmth. There were no small talk tones now, no masks of casualness. Just you and him, shoulders brushing sometimes, not pulling away. I think the first time I felt really alive, he said, was when I got lost in a city I didn't know. No phone, no plan. I just followed the sounds of music coming from a balcony. Did you find it? You asked, eyes on him. He nodded. It was a wedding. They invited me in. I didn't understand a word of the language, but I danced until morning. You laughed, picturing it. That doesn't even sound real. I'm starting to think the best moments rarely do. You paused. Mine was in a train station, you said quietly, surprising even yourself. I missed my train. It was late, and I was crying for reasons I barely remember now. And then this old woman sat beside me, didn't speak a word of English. She just handed me a piece of bread and patted my hand like I was her granddaughter. We didn't say anything, just sat together for an hour. He was quiet for a beat. That's beautiful. You shrugged, staring at your knees. It was just a moment. Maybe, he said. But maybe that's all the best things are. Your throat tightened in that way. It does when someone echoes something you didn't know you needed to hear. Neither of you mentioned the elevator anymore. It had become irrelevant. You'd passed the threshold where the details of the world mattered. The space was now a backdrop, not a container. You leaned a little closer without realizing, not enough to make it obvious, just enough to feel the gravity shifting. He asked what you dreamed of doing if no one was watching. You asked what he would say to his younger self. He admitted he used to be afraid of silence. You told him you still are sometimes. And somehow, neither of you felt the need to fill it anymore. He told you about a letter he never sent. You told him about a love you never named. And still, neither of you touched the thing between you. Not directly. Not yet. Instead, you circled it like two people watching firelight dance in a room neither wants to leave. I don't usually talk like this, you admitted. Me neither, he replied, not even pretending to hide the wonder in his voice. You both smiled at the confession because it was true. And because it wasn't about the talking God, it was about being heard. Eventually, you leaned your head against the wall again, more relaxed. Now, legs stretched out beside his. He shifted, resting his arm near yours. Your elbows brushed. You didn't move. He didn't either. Neither of you dared to say what this felt like. Maybe because it was too soon. Maybe because naming it might make it vanish. But the knowing lingered between you like breath on glass. And when your fingers rested a little too close, you still didn't speak it. You just stayed quiet and strangely full. Asterisk, you hadn't moved much. Neither had he. But the air had changed. It wasn't just warmer in the literal sense, though it was that too. As if the breath of two people sitting too long in a closed space had started to tint the walls with softness. No, it was something else. The kind of warmth that arrives when distance begins to dissolve without permission. When you don't mean to lean in, and yet somehow you are already closer than you were. The elevator didn't jolt. The lights didn't flicker. Nothing dramatic announced this change. It was quiet, incremental, the kind of shift you only notice because something deep in your chest starts to hum with awareness of his elbow resting beside yours, of your thighs angled just slightly toward each other, of your breathing sinking without discussion. You weren't touching, not really, but you were no longer just sharing space. You were sharing something quieter and heavier. He said something about music then, about how he used to fall asleep to jazz records when he was a kid, the kind his father played while reading in the next room. You listened not just to the story, but to his voice. The way it dropped at the end of sentences, the way it softened when he wasn't trying to sound interesting. I always thought the saxophone sounded like longing. He said, "You nodded, like it wants something it can't quite ask for." He turned his head, looked at you slowly, not startled, not surprised. Just that soft, steady gaze that made your ribs feel too delicate to hold your heart. You didn't look away. There wasn't a reason to anymore. The tension between you wasn't awkward now. It was something sweeter, like the last edge of hesitation before something opens. You weren't sure whether to move closer or stay exactly where you were, but you knew either choice would mean something. The air felt heavy in a kind way, like a warm blanket thrown across a conversation. You adjusted your position slightly, letting your knee brush his. You didn't apologize. He didn't flinch. The contact wasn't charged. It wasn't suggestive, but it stayed. You both grew quieter, not because there was nothing left to say, but because silence had started to feel like part of the language you shared. There's something intimate about saying nothing, something more vulnerable than speech. He ran a hand through his hair once, glancing at the floor as if grounding himself. Then he asked, "Do you believe in fate?" You hesitated. Sometimes. Sometimes. When it's quiet like this, you admitted, "I think maybe everything happens on purpose." His eyes didn't leave yours. "I think that too." The quiet stretched again. The air truly did feel warmer now, like the metal walls themselves had softened, like the elevator had become something else, entirely a cocoon. A pause in the middle of the world where two people could exist without roles or expectations or even names. You noticed the curve of his wrist, the faint veins along the inside of his forearm. He noticed the way your hands folded in your lap, fingers tracing invisible shapes. You weren't flirting. You weren't performing. You were simply there, fully undistracted, and held in the center of a moment that asked for nothing but presence. And still, you didn't touch, not yet, but your body had already begun to memorize the space between you and your heart. It had already leaned forward. Asterisk, you hadn't meant to sit this close. At first, the space between you had felt like a buffer, a respectful cushion built by two strangers who were simply trying to pass time without discomfort. But as the minutes passed long, soft and unmeasured, Those few inches of air slowly thinned, not by movement, but by mood. It wasn't that your bodies moved closer. It was your attention that leaned in, the kind that folds toward another person without asking permission from your spine. Without realizing it, you had slipped past the polite edges of awareness and into something else entirely. You could feel it not in your skin exactly, but in that deeper place that warms before it touches. The elevator hadn't budged. No creaks or flickers to interrupt the stillness. And yet something had shifted. Again. You could feel the echo of it in your chest, like a bell that had been rung gently just once, long ago, still humming in the bones of the space. You became aware of every breath, the subtle weight of silence between his words, the way your knees no longer seemed hesitant to drift nearer to his. The temperature hadn't actually changed, but the air wrapped around you differently, now thicker, slower, like honey being poured in candlelight. Even your fingertips felt heavier, aware of themselves in a new way, as though they were waiting for a reason to reach. He was talking about music, his voice lower now. Not in secrecy, but in intimacy, like a hand placed lightly on a table near yours. He told you about how he used to fall asleep as a child to the sound of his father's jazz records, old vinyls spinning quietly while the house settled into night. You listened not only to the story, but to his tone, the gentle rhythm of it. The way it wrapped around each word with the kind of softness that didn't ask for anything in return. His words felt like a blanket passed between you, familiar, earnest, real. I always thought the saxophone sounded like longing, he said, eyes following the thought up toward the ceiling. You didn't answer immediately. You let the idea settle before offering your own, like it wants something it can't quite ask for, you said. And when your voice reached him, he looked over at you slowly, like something in him recognized something in you he didn't expect to find here. In this moment, in this box between floors dot, his gaze didn't linger too long, but it didn't flinch away either. It stayed just long enough for something unspoken to be acknowledged, not flirtation, not assumption, just recognition, as though you'd both stumbled into a language neither of you had ever learned, but somehow already knew. There was a quiet in the elevator now that didn't feel empty. It felt like it was holding something sacred, something still unfolding. And though you hadn't meant to, your knee brushed his. You didn't apologize. He didn't adjust. The contact stayed. He reached up briefly to rub the back of his neck, exhaling like he hadn't meant to let that much of himself out. Do you believe in fate? He asked suddenly, and you turned to look at him, not because you needed to see his face to answer, but because the question deserved a full response. It had weight. It had ache behind it. It wasn't a rhetorical musing, it was a quiet test, a key offered in case you had a matching lock. Sometimes, you said, when it's quiet like this, I think maybe everything happens on purpose. He nodded slowly and for a few seconds said nothing. Yeah, he finally replied. I think that too. You felt your ribs shift slightly then, not with breath, but with some small loosening. Something deep in your chest responding to being met. Because that's what it felt like, not being heard, not being understood, but being met. Not across the room, not across a date, but right here. In this pause between seconds, between floors, between lives that might never have crossed if not for this strange moment, you let your head lean back against the wall. The metal felt cool, a contrast to the warmth blooming quietly beneath your collarbones. His shoulder was near now, not quite brushing yours, but close enough that the heat from his body reached you like a whisper. The stillness between you no longer felt tentative. It felt like rest, like a kind of exhale neither of you had realized you were holding. He began to speak again, not loudly, and not to break the silence, but to continue the rhythm you'd both begun to share. You talked about childhood things, about names you hadn't said aloud in years, about little joys and embarrassments and all the tender clutter we carry into adulthood and rarely unpack unless someone holds space for us to lay it all out. Weren't trying to impress him. He wasn't trying to charm you. That part had passed. Now it was something else, something rooted, easy, a warmth that asked nothing of you but your presence. And still, neither of you said what was happening. Neither of you named the feeling, because to name it too soon would be to give it rules, to box it in. You weren't ready to say it, but you were ready to feel it. The way his hand rested near yours on the floor, palm open. The way his breath slowed to match yours again. The way your gaze lingered on his lips, not with intention, but with a kind of wondering. Wondering what they might feel like, or sound like, or tremble like, if the moment ever allowed. But for now, the silence held. The elevator still hadn't moved, and you didn't want it to. Asterisk. The minutes passed unnoticed. Too gently to measure. You didn't check the time. Neither did he. Maybe the air made you forget it. Maybe you didn't want to know how long you'd been sitting together, saying more than most people say over coffee, over months, over years of planned conversation. There was something about this kind of closeness, accidental, quiet, earned. Not through effort, but through simple attention that made time slip sideways. The kind of moment you didn't want to mark because it felt somehow like marking it would make it go. You must have shifted, or sighed, or leaned too long against the wall because he noticed. Noticed the way your spine adjusted, the subtle pinch of your shoulders, the way your breath caught in discomfort. He didn't say anything at first, just moved slightly, his hands pulling at something behind him. Then, without ceremony, he folded his jacket and offered it out, palm up, eyes soft. You hesitated, but not for long. There was no flourish in the gesture, no implication, just something warm offered, You took it. His jacket was heavier than it looked, worn in at the seams, soft with use. You placed it behind your head and leaned back again. It smelled faintly of clean cotton and the echo of his day something. Lived in human grounding. And when you let your weight settle into it, something in you nodded. You hadn't realized how much tension you were holding in your neck, your shoulders, your jaw. But with your head resting against this quiet gift, it all seemed to dissolve. He didn't comment, didn't tease, just sat beside you with his arms draped loosely over his knees, gaze drifting somewhere near the floor, like he was lost in the space between thought and noticing. And maybe he was. You didn't try to ask what he was thinking. You didn't want to interrupt it, but after a while, the silence took on a different shape. Not heavy dot, not sharp dot, just full. Full of all the things you weren't saying, full of awareness, of warmth, of the almost touch. Your fingers were closer now, not touching, not yet, but dancing along the edges of courage. You didn't know who shifted first. Maybe both of you had been leaning toward that invisible seam at the same time, the one between still strangers and almost not. You turned your head slightly, just enough to see him from the edge of your vision. He was already watching you, but not in the way that made your skin shrink back dot, in the way that made it settle dot, as if he saw all of you and didn't feel the need to name what he saw. That kind of gaze can feel like both a gift and a mirror. You weren't used to it. Not like this. Not this quietly. Not with this much stillness wrapped around it. You felt something rise in you, then something soft but hungry. Something that wanted to know how the back of his hand might feel under your palm, how his shoulder might fit beneath your cheek if the lights dimmed just slightly more. You didn't act on it, but you didn't pull away either dot. The distance between you now felt like a line drawn in warm. Sand dot cross able dot, but not yet. Maybe not ever. You looked at your hand, at how near it was to his. Your pinky flexed without meaning to. You let it. You let yourself hover just close enough to notice the heat that passed between knuckles. Not a gesture, not an invitation. Just presence. Honest and open and waiting dot. He didn't move. He didn't need to. There was something sacred about the restraint, something more intimate than the act itself. The knowledge that both of you could lean, could ask, could take, and yet didn't. Not because you didn't want to, but because the wanting was enough, more than enough. You closed your eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not to escape, but to feel, to take it all in. The still air, the steady hum of electricity behind the walls, the sound of his breathing, slow and sure beside yours, the warmth from his jacket, the ache of the almost touch, the shape of a moment that would never repeat itself quite the same way again. You could have reached out. You almost a dot, but sometimes it is the almost that makes something unforgettable. Asterisk at first. It was just a soft hum. Barely there. A murmur in the wiring, a subtle shift in the air around the corners of the ceiling. You didn't even register it consciously. It was like the elevator breathed, or maybe sighed. A slow inhale of systems reawakening, cables stretching far above. Your head's like nerves testing sensation after too long a sleep. Then came the flicker just once. A pulse of light overhead, a single second where the fluorescent glow blinked, dimmed, and returned. Not gone, just unstable. Just enough to say, the world outside might be remembering you now. You both noticed. You didn't speak, but your eyes lifted at the same time. You met gazes not in alarm, but in quiet dread. Not because you were scared of movement or machines or rescue, but because this stillness, this warm, uninterrupted cocoon of breath and nearness and the strange vulnerability of undemanding attention it might end. You both leaned back again, subtly, reflexively, like trying to push time backward. By posture alone, the silence between you changed again, not colder, not broken, just more alert, as if the air itself knew that its spell might not last much longer. He didn't speak. You didn't either, not at first, because naming it would make it real, would place a clock on something that had been, until now, beautifully timeless. So instead, you both stayed still, letting your heads rest, your eyes drift. But inside, your thoughts were not still. Inside, something curled tighter. A knot of wanting the elevator to stay broken, wanting the world to stay paused, wanting the boundary between stranger and more to never have to be tested by daylight. The second flicker came minutes later. This time, the lights held steady after dimming. You heard it now, a faint buzz returning to the panels. A breath of motion long withheld. A groan in the shaft, deep below or maybe high above. And still, you didn't speak. But then he did, quietly, like he was saying it to himself. I didn't think I'd want to stay. You turned your head slowly. Neither did I. You looked at each other, not for answers, but for permission. For confirmation that the ache in your chest wasn't just yours. That the strange intimacy you'd built wasn't imagined or one-sided. That this had been real, even if the world was coming back to get you. You wanted to reach for his hand. You wanted him to reach for yours. But the flickering light reminded you both that some moments aren't meant to be extended. They're meant to be kept, held in the softest pocket of memory, folded into the lining of the night like a pressed flower, fragile, fading, and yet immortal in its own quiet way. I don't know your name, you whispered. He smiled, but not with amusement, with something like awe, and still. I feel like I've known you longer than I've known most people. You didn't need more than that, Dot. There was no pressure. FO numbers or for tomorrows. The magic of it was that it had lived in the now, fully, without reaching. Without holding Dot, the elevator gave a soft jolt. Dot, just a warning. Just the breath before waking Dot, and in that breath, You let yourself feel everything at once. The warmth of his jacket still beneath your neck. Uwe's thigh had stayed next to yours, barely brushing, like a conversation neither of you wanted to interrupt, the rhythm of your breaths sinking without command. The way the silence had said so much more than words could have dared to say. You looked at him, really looked, and he looked back, still. Neither of you moved, not yet, because even in the flicker of lights and the hum of systems rebooting, this moment was still yours. Still held, still unfinished, still something. You weren't ready to give back to the world. It started with a low rumble, deep and familiar, like a train far off in the dark, except this time it was close, surrounding you, waking the metal skin of the elevator from its long, generous sleep. The hum beneath your bodies shifted into motion, just a tremor at first. Then a glide so smooth it made your stomach lift gently, a whisper of gravity catching its breath. And that was when you really knew that. The spell had been broken. The elevator was moving again. Returning. Remembering its function. And the strange floating pause you had shared. This box of suspended reality. This unexpected pocket of safety and breath and closeness was slipping back into the stream of time where it belonged. But you didn't move, neither of you. Your bodies stayed where they were, spines curled against the wall, heads tilted in quiet defiance, arms still, folded loosely over knees or resting beside one another, like you could outweigh the motion by stillness alone. Like if you didn't acknowledge it, maybe it wouldn't count. Maybe the world couldn't reclaim you until you stood up and let it. He didn't speak, and neither did you. Not right away. You both just listened. To the sound of return, the whirring of cables, the soft tick of passing floors, the faint buzz of a machine carrying you both back to something much less tender than where you'd just been. The elevator no longer felt like a secret room. It felt like what it was, a mechanism, a system, a vessel for endings. Your body remained still, but inside you, everything fluttered. That ache of almost, that grief of closeness that never asked to last, that gentle panic that comes not from fear, but from the knowledge that something beautiful is ending in the exact shape and time it was always meant to. You wanted to stop it, to reach for something, to ask him not to let go, but you also didn't want to bruise it. Not this. Not this softness that had bloomed so quietly between you. So you just breathed. Together. Without touching. Still. He turned his head first. Not to speak, but just to look. His expression wasn't sad, but it wasn't neutral either. It was full of everything the two of you had lived in silence, everything you'd spoken in fragments, and everything you hadn't dared to say aloud. The recognition in his eyes was more than acknowledgement. It was gratitude. It was something like awe. And you knew right then that he had felt it too. All of it, every slow second, every wordless shift in air. You wanted to say something, but there was no language for this. not one that wouldn't cheapen it. So instead, you offered him a smile, small, tired, real, the kind that only comes after sharing something quiet and profound. And he smiled back. The elevator slowed, that breath before the doors opened, that moment when motion gives way to choice. Still, neither of you stood. Not at first. You both stayed on the floor, stubborn in your stillness, as if by delaying the rise to your feet, you could stretch the story just a little longer. You were no longer bound by the accident of being stuck. Now staying was a choice. And so was leaving. Finally, gently, he stood. He didn't stretch. Didn't crack his joints. He simply rose, like someone waking from a dream they don't want to shake off too fast. Then he offered you a hand, not rushed, not performative. Just there, waiting, not for obligation, but for closeness. You took it, Dot, and when you rose, the warmth of his palm lingered in yours longer than it should have, and still. Neither of you pulled away. The elevator came to a stop. The light above blinked once, and the doors opened. Asterisk, the doors opened with a polite chime. Soft, unremarkable. The same sound you'd heard countless times in your life, but this time it startled you. Not in a jump or a flinch, but in your breath. Something tugged in your chest, something small and invisible, like a thread that had been gently clipped. The air beyond the elevator poured in too quickly, too bright, too real. The quiet you'd been living in wasn't built for this kind of light. You stepped out slowly, your legs unsure whether they belonged to someone who had just sat on a floor for what felt like forever, or someone who had dreamed the whole thing. The marble beneath your shoes was colder than you remembered, too clean, too hard. The echo of your footsteps didn't sound like you, and the lobby, the ordinary, echoing lobby, felt enormous. You hadn't noticed how much smaller your world had become, how tightly it had curled into that silver-walled box with its hush and stillness and warmth. Now, in this space, everything expanded too fast. The lights were too sharp. The people at the reception desk were too loud, even though they were speaking softly. A man passed by on his phone, laughing, and it sounded like it belonged to another dimension beside you. He walked quietly, not ahead, Dot, not behind, just next to you. Like he wasn't sure if you'd both agree on where this story ended. You didn't speak, not yet. You were both adjusting, blinking into this new version of the same old world. You could feel your body reassembling its shape, putting back on the armor of the day. The silence of strangers, the weight of names and shoulds and schedules. But it didn't quite fit anymore. The version of you that stepped off that elevator had changed, subtly but undeniably. You felt stretched, exposed in a way no one else could see. You were carrying something inside you now that hadn't been there before. You looked at him once, out of the corner of your eye. He seemed different, too, quieter in the shoulders, softer at the corners. He looked like someone who had just held something precious and wasn't quite ready to let it go. The doors of the elevator slid, closed behind you, and that was it. The box was gone. You were here now, dot in the world again, and the noise you heard wasn't volume dot, it was separation, the growing distance between what had just been possible and what was allowed now. He cleared his throat softly. I guess we're back. You nodded, not trusting your voice just yet. You wanted to say, but we're not the same, but instead, you just smiled. A small, tired smile. One that said, I know. You stood there for a moment, not quite ready to walk away. The moment pressed in around you, begging for a decision. The kind of decision that feels bigger than it looks. You could say something now, ask for coffee, a number, a name. Or you could let the moment stay what it was, perfect, unbothered, whole in its own silence. He looked down at you, and for a second, you could see the question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. And you didn't either, dot, because sometimes the beauty of a moment isn't UNTOUCHABI dot, and sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let something end while it's still glowing. He reached out gently, lightly grazing your hand, not a grasp, not a hold. Just a warmth passed from one skin to another, a quiet thank you in gesture form. You returned it with your fingers barely moving, but enough to say me too, dot, and then you both turned dot away, dot not rushed, dot just ready. The lobby remained loud behind you, too bright, too fast, too filled with other lives. But inside you, there was a quiet that no one could hear, a secret space the world couldn't touch, something small and sacred that would stay with you longer than you could have guessed, something that began between floors and refused to fall away even as the world spun forward. You walked out into the day like someone stepping barefoot onto a stage after the curtain has already dropped. The air had changed, or maybe it hadn't, but it felt different, thinner, less forgiving. You were back in the real world, surrounded by noise and motion and expectation. And yet, something inside you still sat cross-legged on a metal floor, head resting on a borrowed jacket, listening to the hush between two strangers who had, for a brief spell, become something quietly extraordinary, dot. It occurred to you as you turned the corner. He never said his name, and neither did you. There had been so much space for it, so many small pauses where one of you could have filled in that basic blank, planted a seed for what might happen next. But you hadn't, not out of negligence and not out of fear. It had simply not been necessary. There had been no role to play, no story to feed, no identity to prove. You were just two people sharing one small breath of time without the burden of backstory. And in that space, something deeper had emerged. Something nameless. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it had existed beyond the structures where names matter. You hadn't memorized his features in detail. You couldn't recite the exact color of his eyes or the shape of his jaw, but you remembered the sound of his breathing, the way it shifted when you leaned closer, the subtle hitch when you asked a question that touched something old in him, the rhythm of his lungs finding yours, not through force, but through trust. His breath had spoken more than his voice ever did. And now, when you closed your eyes, that's what you heard. Breathing, that soft, sacred rhythm. Inhale, pause, exhale, stillness, presence. That was what had made it. So intimate, not the proximity, not the brushing knees, not even the flickering light or the shared jacket. It was that you had both been fully there, without defense, breathing together like children do when they sleep side by side, as if your bodies remembered something ancient about closeness that your minds had forgotten. You could still feel the warmth of that moment in your chest, like a slow ember, not burning but glowing. It didn't ache, it didn't ask. It just lingered like steam after a long bath, soft and private. And you realized then that you weren't mourning the loss of the moment. You were grateful, because how rare it is to be seen in silence, to be met without a checklist, to be held not by hands, but by attention. You didn't need to follow him. You didn't need to run back and ask for more. The story was complete, not in the way movies end, not with a kiss or a promise or a vow, but with breath. Shared breath, honest breath. Two strangers resting inside a pause in the world, not trying to turn it into anything else. Maybe that's what made it stay, not because it was unfinished, but because it had been whole. You would carry that breathing with you in crowded rooms, in lonely kitchens, in the quiet of your own bed, not haunting, not loud, just there. Like a note you can't stop humming, like a window left open on a night that smelled like something you once loved. Asterisk that night, long after. You'd showered the city from your skin and tucked yourself between clean sheets. The stillness came back. Not the kind the elevator had given you, not made of metal and chance and someone else's breath beside you, but the same kind of hush. Inside, uncheckable, familiar now. You lay on your back, head tilted toward the ceiling, and the room felt wider than usual, emptier, but not lonely. Just open like a question you weren't in a rush to answer. You stared up at the blank white square above your bed as if it were a sky. Not because you were looking for patterns, but because something in you wanted to remember what it felt like. To float between floors, between choices, between names and destinations. That place where everything had been still and slow and warm. Where the air had listened, where your chest had softened without being asked to. You closed your eyes, and there it was again, the faintest echo of breathing that wasn't yours. Not a sound now, just a memory, but vivid like a chord still vibrating after the music has ended. Didn't need to see him. You didn't need to go back. The story wasn't about him anymore, not exactly. It was about you. The version of you that had emerged in that quiet box of nowhere. The version that had leaned in instead of away. that had spoken without armor, that had accepted stillness like a gift instead of a delay. You had met yourself there too, hadn't you? That thought brought a soft ache to your ribs. The kind that doesn't hurt, just pulses. The way it does when you almost cry but don't. When you feel full but nothing spills. That ceiling above you, it wasn't telling stories. It wasn't showing stars, but you saw them anyway. Little fragments of warmth, moments suspended in the soft air between breaths. You could still picture his face, not clearly, not like a photograph, but like a mood. Like the way dusk feels right before the streetlights hum awake. Quiet, uncertain, beautiful. You turned on your side, slowly, like not to disturb whatever was settling in your chest. The room was dark now, but your mind was lit with small flickers. The way his jacket had smelled. The way he didn't flinch when your knees touched. The way neither of you named what was happening. And yet both of you knew that was the star stuff of the moment. That was what made it stay. You imagined his breathing again, just once more. Not to hold it, but to honor it. To press it like a flower into the pages of your night. To say, this mattered, even if no one else will ever know it did. You reached for your pillow the way you'd reached for silence in that elevator. Not to escape, but to rest. To pause. You didn't need anything more. Not a name. Not a text, not a reason. The night had spoken and you'd listened. Two people, strangers still, but not lost. Just passed through each other like songs playing in nearby rooms, briefly in tune. Then apart again, you let your eyes flutter closed, and in that darkness, your ceiling became a sky, a quiet, familiar sky filled with stars you'd never name, but would never forget. And when the elevator moved again, they did not. Not in the ways that matter, because something stayed behind in that metal box, in the hush between breaths. In the way a stranger's voice can feel like your own heartbeat answering itself. They didn't trade names. They didn't trade numbers. But they traded something quieter, a warmth, a recognition. A few borrowed minutes that no one else will ever know happened, but which they'll carry quietly. Always dot, so as you close your eyes tonight, think of the spaces in between. The ones not mapped, the ones where time lets go. Where love isn't loud, but real dot. And if you find yourself between floors someday, waiting, breathing, watching the lights flicker, perhaps you'll remember this story and smile. Because not every goodbye needs to be spoken. Some just live inside you dot forever.